You know, there's something special about learning a language through stories, especially short stories. They have a rhythm, a charm, and a simplicity that makes them incredibly powerful for language learners. When you're reading or listening to a short story, you're not just memorizing vocabulary or drilling grammar rules. You're stepping into a world. You're experiencing situations, emotions, conversations, and culture, all in a way that feels completely natural. Think about how we all first learned our native language. It wasn't through textbooks or structured lessons. It was through listening to stories told by parents, friends, or even through the little tales we heard around us growing up. Short stories in that way mimic this process. They allow learners to absorb English the same way, through context, emotion, and real life scenarios. That's what makes learning English this way so effective. It mirrors how we naturally pick up language from the world around us. A short story doesn't overwhelm you. It's not pages and pages of dense text or long lectures filled with rules. Instead, it gives you something manageable, a slice of life, a brief moment, a simple plot that you can enjoy in one sitting. And while you're enjoying it, without even noticing it, you're learning. You're hearing how questions are asked, how polite requests are made, how humor works in conversation, and even how British people use small talk or express feelings. It's effortless learning because it's embedded in something meaningful and enjoyable. One of the most exciting things about short stories is how they connect vocabulary to emotion. When you read the word cold in a grammar book, it's just a word. But when you read a story about a child walking home through a frosty evening, rubbing their hands together and seeing their breath in the air, you feel the word cold. You understand it on a deeper level. That's how words stick. That's how vocabulary becomes memorable. Because you don't just learn the word, you experience it, and there's something else. Short stories allow learners to revisit content easily. Because they're short, you can listen to the same story multiple times. The first time, you might just enjoy it. The second time, you might notice a few unfamiliar words. The third time, you're understanding nearly everything and even anticipating the next sentence. That repetition without the boredom of traditional drills is incredibly powerful for building fluency. Also, let's not forget, stories entertain. Learning doesn't have to be dry or mechanical. You can laugh, feel suspense, feel empathy, all while learning English. That emotional connection keeps motivation high. It's what makes someone want to come back the next day and listen again. If learning feels like a chore, people give up. But if it feels like watching your favorite show or reading a good book, they keep going. And consistency is everything when learning a language. Through short stories, you also meet characters you care about. Maybe a curious child in London, or a lost dog rescued in a snowy village, or two friends who solve a misunderstanding through a funny text message mix-up. These characters model real British English conversations in ways that textbooks never could. They teach through example, not explanation, and because of that, what you learn stays with you. When we tell modern, original stories written in British English, they reflect the way people actually speak today. That means learners are exposed to up-to-date expressions, natural sentence structures, and real cultural references. It's not just English. It's the kind of English that's spoken on the streets, in shops, on public transport, or in cafes. That's the language learners want. That's the language they need, and best of all, stories can be adapted for every level. Whether you're just starting out or you're pushing towards fluency, there's a story that fits your journey. At the beginner level, the sentences are simple, the vocabulary is clear, and the pace is gentle. As you grow in confidence, the stories become more complex. the characters richer, the themes deeper. But no matter the level, the joy of learning through storytelling remains the same. One of the things that makes British English stories so effective for learners is how naturally they introduce real life vocabulary and modern expressions. When you learn through stories, you're not just memorizing isolated words or old-fashioned textbook phrases. You're hearing the language that people actually use every day in conversations, on the street, at work, or at home. That difference is huge. When learners try to improve their English, one of the biggest challenges is figuring out what's actually used in the real world. You might learn a phrase in a grammar lesson, but when you visit an English speaking place or talk to a native speaker, you realize no one really talks like that. That's where modern British stories can help in a big way. They bridge the gap between the English you learn in a classroom and the English you hear in real life. Stories offer that in a smooth and effortless way. They're full of natural conversations, common phrases, and modern expressions that reflect how people speak today, not how they spoke 30 years ago. Whether it's a teenager saying, "I'm knackered," after school, or someone casually asking, "Fancy a cuppa," these moments reflect authentic, up-to-date language. And because the phrases are connected to characters and context, you don't just understand the meaning, you understand the feeling behind it, the tone, the timing, and when it's appropriate to use. For example, let's say you come across the word cheeky in a story. A character might say, "We had a cheeky little takeaway last night." Now, if you only had the dictionary definition, you might think it means someone is being rude. But in the context of the story, you realize cheeky is often used in a light-hearted way, something slightly naughty but fun. That kind of understanding only comes from hearing language in context, and stories provide that beautifully. What also makes British English stories so valuable is the rich variety of vocabulary they expose you to. It's not just about learning the most common words, it's about hearing the right words used in the right situations. British English has its own flavor, phrases like gutted, dodgy, brilliant, or can't be bothered, and these are everywhere in everyday life. But they rarely show up in formal lessons. So, when you hear them used naturally in a story, especially when paired with emotions or reactions, they become clear and easy to remember. And it's not just slang or casual phrases. British stories also reflect politeness, humor, and subtle cultural norms. For instance, someone might say, "Sorry, would you mind?" instead of "Can you?" That small change shows how politeness works in British English, and it teaches learners how to sound natural and respectful without needing a grammar explanation. Just by listening and reading along, you pick it up. Modern expressions are constantly evolving too, and when stories are written recently, they reflect these changes. You'll hear how people actually text, how they make plans, or how they joke with each other in today's world. These modern touches make learners feel more confident when they speak, because they're not worried about sounding outdated or robotic. They sound real. That builds self-esteem and helps people connect with others more easily. Stories also teach vocabulary across a wide range of topics: family life, friendships, emotions, work situations, public transport, shopping, celebrations, even misunderstandings. And when learners hear words used in these everyday situations, they remember them longer. It's no longer just a list of words to memorize. It becomes part of a scene, a character's voice, a moment that made them smile or think. That's how vocabulary sticks, not because you repeat it 10 times, but because you experienced it once in a way that felt real. Another benefit is that learners can absorb the rhythm and music of British English. Through dialogue and narration, they get used to sentence stress, intonation, and how thoughts are naturally grouped. Even if a learner doesn't understand every single word, their ear begins to recognize patterns. That's the foundation of fluency, and it comes far more easily through stories than through repetition drills. At every level, beginner, intermediate, or advanced, stories can be crafted to suit the learner's ability while still introducing them to real-life vocabulary. A beginner might learn simple phrases like "I'm late," or "that's nice," while an advanced learner might come across expressions like "I was taken aback," or "it slipped my mind," and because the words are part of a scene, they're easier to guess, easier to remember, and easier to use later in a real conversation. That's why British English stories are such a powerful tool. They don't just teach words, they teach how people live, speak, and express themselves today. One of the most encouraging things about learning English through stories is that they can be written and tailored for absolutely every level, from someone just starting their journey with a few basic words to someone who's almost fluent and just wants to polish their natural flow. That flexibility is what makes storytelling such a powerful teaching tool. No matter where you are in your English learning path, there's always a story waiting for you, one that matches your ability and helps you gently move forward. For complete beginners, stories can start off with very simple language, short sentences, everyday vocabulary, and clear ideas. The goal isn't to overwhelm or confuse. It's to introduce English in a way that feels welcoming and achievable. Maybe it's a short story about someone's daily routine, or about going to the shop, or meeting a friend. The characters might speak slowly and clearly. The sentences are easy to follow, but even in that simplicity, learners begin to feel success. They understand something, they follow along, and that sense of progress is incredibly motivating. Instead of jumping into long grammar explanations or memorizing rules, beginners learn how the language works through real examples. A character says, "I am hungry," and it clicks that's how to say it. They hear "she has a cat" and realize how "has" fits in naturally. It's not about rules first and usage second. It's the other way around. Usage comes first. The rules settle in afterward, almost like a quiet echo. That's how real learning happens. It's natural, smooth, and it builds confidence from the very beginning. Then, as learners grow and move into the intermediate stage, the stories grow with them. The language becomes a little more complex. Sentences are richer. There's more description, more dialogue, and maybe even some gentle twists in the plot. At this level, learners start to pick up on the details, not just what someone is saying, but how and why. They begin to notice tone, mood, and character emotion. They hear how two people argue politely, or how sarcasm sounds in English, or how someone shows kindness without using obvious words. These deeper layers of communication can't be taught easily through grammar charts, but they're absorbed beautifully through story. At the intermediate level, stories help learners bridge the gap between knowing individual words and using full expression. They might already know the words tired and very, but through stories they learn phrases like "I'm absolutely exhausted" or "I could do with a rest." These are the expressions that make someone sound natural, and hearing them in a believable context makes all the difference. Learners don't just collect words, they learn how to build with them, how to express ideas more precisely, and how to understand the subtle choices native speakers make. Then, as learners reach an advanced level, the stories offer even more depth. The vocabulary expands further, sentences become more nuanced, maybe the story deals with complicated relationships, workplace dynamics, or emotional turning points. At this stage, learners are refining their ear for tone and their instinct for phrasing. They are noticing idioms, cultural references, humor, irony, all the rich, challenging layers of English that textbooks rarely capture. And what's amazing is that the story still doesn't feel like a lesson. It feels like literature. It feels like connection. That's when learners really feel the language coming alive inside them. But even at that confident stage, stories continue to teach. They introduce new vocabulary that even experienced learners might not have come across. They challenge the reader to think critically, reflect emotionally, and respond to language in a way that's far more complex than answering a multiple-choice question. And because the stories are written with the learner in mind, they offer just the right balance of challenge and clarity. They stretch, but they don't strain. What makes this approach so special is that it respects where every learner is on their journey. It doesn't rush beginners. It doesn't bore advanced learners. Instead, it provides stepping stones, each one a story, each one a little world that helps build skill, confidence, and joy in learning. And when learners see that there's always a next story waiting, a slightly harder one, or a slightly easier one to review, it gives them direction. It reminds them that learning is a process, and that they're always moving forward, even when it feels slow. One of the most powerful yet underrated ways to improve English is by simply listening to native storytelling. Not reading along, not analyzing every word, just listening. It sounds so simple, but it's incredibly effective because it brings pronunciation, rhythm, and natural understanding all together in one experience. When you listen to native speakers telling stories, you're not only hearing the words. They are being brought to life with tone, emotion, and natural flow. And that does something special in your brain. It tunes your ear, it shapes your speech, it builds your instincts for the language. Pronunciation, in particular, is something that learners often worry about. They might ask, "Am I saying this right?" Or "Do I sound strange when I speak?" And the truth is, pronunciation isn't something you can just memorize. You can't learn it from a phonetic chart and expect to speak smoothly. You learn pronunciation by hearing it again and again in real contexts, from real voices. That's why storytelling works so well. It surrounds you with natural sound. You hear how native speakers link words together, how they stress certain syllables, how their tone changes depending on the mood or meaning. It's not just language, it's music, and the more you listen, the more you start to play that music naturally yourself. When a story is told aloud by a native speaker, it becomes more than just words. It becomes expression. A pause here, a rise in the voice there, a quick laugh, a slow sigh. All these little details teach you how English sounds in real life. These are things you can't fully capture just by reading, because reading is flat. Listening gives you dimension, it gives you melody, and the amazing part is, you don't even have to be actively studying to benefit from it. Just by enjoying a good story, maybe while relaxing, commuting, or even cooking, you're training your ear. Your brain is soaking up the sounds and storing them. Understanding also grows from this process. Listening to storytelling helps you recognize words more quickly. It helps you get used to the speed of natural speech, especially in British English where certain sounds are softer, and words often blend together. At first, it might feel fast, but with regular exposure, your ear begins to catch patterns. You start predicting what comes next. You understand not just individual words, but full ideas. And before long, You're not just translating in your head, you're thinking in English. That's when true fluency begins. What's even more powerful is that stories give you context. You're not just hearing random sentences, you're hearing sentences that build a world that makes understanding easier and more intuitive. For example, even if you don't understand every single word in a story about a lost dog finding its way home, you can still follow the emotions, the actions, and the flow. That context supports your understanding, so you're never lost. And over time, that support lets you take in more and more complex language without needing everything to be perfect. Another benefit of listening to native storytelling is that it helps you feel more confident when you speak. The more you hear English spoken well, the more you can mimic it. You hear how questions are asked, how emotions are expressed, how pauses create impact, and gradually your own voice begins to reflect those patterns. You stop second guessing, you stop hesitating, you begin to speak with more clarity and rhythm, not because you practiced a pronunciation drill, but because you've internalized the way English sounds. And then there's something a little deeper, something more human. Listening to stories told by native speakers builds a sense of connection. You feel the emotion in someone's voice. You follow their journey. You hear their laughter, their worry, their joy. It's not just about learning the language. It's about feeling the language. And when you feel something, it stays with you. It becomes part of how you think, how you express yourself, and how you understand others. Whether you're listening to a short story at the beginner level or a complex narrative as an advanced learner, that connection to native speech is always valuable. It keeps your learning rooted in reality. It helps you grow not just as a speaker, but as a listener, a thinker, and a communicator. And all of that begins with one simple, powerful action: listening to a story. When we talk about learning English, we often separate grammar, vocabulary, and fluency into different categories. One lesson focuses on tenses, another on word lists, another on conversation practice. But in real life, these elements aren't separate. They all work together every time we speak, listen, read, or write. That's why stories are such an effective tool for learning. Each story naturally weaves grammar, vocabulary, and fluency into one experience. You don't have to focus on each part individually. Instead, you absorb them all at once, without even realizing it. Grammar, for example, becomes something you see in action rather than something you study on a page. When you read or listen to a story, you hear how people actually use grammar, not in textbook examples, but in real, meaningful communication. You don't just learn what the past perfect is. You hear a character say, "I had already left when she called," and it clicks. It makes sense because it fits the moment in the story. That context helps your brain understand how grammar works and why it works that way. The best part is that stories provide repetition without being repetitive. You might hear the present simple used naturally again and again. He walks to school, she drinks tea, they play football, but because it's part of a narrative, it doesn't feel boring. You're not drilling a rule, you're following a life and experience. The repetition is hidden inside the flow of the story, and that makes learning smooth and enjoyable. It's grammar through exposure, not pressure. Vocabulary, too, becomes easier to learn when it's wrapped in a story. Instead of memorizing a list of words with no context, you meet the words inside real situations. If a story is about someone moving into a new flat, you might learn words like landlord, lease, furniture, and neighbors. But more importantly, you understand how those words are used. You hear a character say, "I need to sign the lease before Friday," and suddenly the meaning becomes clear. Not just the word, but the situation it belongs to. And because vocabulary appears in context, it becomes easier to remember. It's connected to emotion, to imagery, to action. You don't just remember what exhausted means. You remember the tired father who came home from work and collapsed onto the sofa. That scene helps the word stick. It becomes part of your memory, not just your notes. Now, fluency is something learners often think takes years of speaking practice, and yes, speaking regularly is important. But listening to and reading stories plays a huge role too. Why? Because fluency is about flow. It's about being able to understand and respond naturally without stopping to translate or analyze, and stories teach that flow. When you listen to a story, your brain is constantly working, processing language, predicting what comes next, reacting to new information. Over time, this strengthens your ability to think in English. You get used to sentence patterns, transitions, and expressions. You notice how ideas connect, and slowly your own speech starts to mirror that rhythm. You begin to speak more smoothly, more confidently, because your brain has had plenty of practice hearing language that flows naturally. Stories also encourage internal thinking in English. You start to imagine scenes, picture actions, and understand emotions directly in the language. That's fluency. It's not just speaking fast, it's understanding deeply and expressing clearly. And that ability grows every time you immerse yourself in a story. Another powerful thing about using stories for learning is that you don't have to force any of this. You don't sit down thinking, I'm going to study the present continuous today. Instead, you hear it. You see it. A character says she's waiting at the station, and you understand, you absorb it, and without even realizing, you're learning how to build grammar, expand vocabulary, and improve fluency all at once. And the stories themselves don't need to be complicated. Even a simple one-page story can offer valuable lessons. A conversation between friends might teach 5 new phrases and 3 useful sentence structures. A short monologue from a tired teacher might give you insight into British humor and emotional tone. Every story is full of tiny learning moments, and when you add them up over time, the progress is incredible. Learning through stories is unlike any other method of language learning because it connects on a deeper level. It's not just about memorizing facts or translating words. It's about experiencing something. When you listen to a story, you're not just learning English, you're stepping into someone else's world. You hear their voice, feel their emotions, follow their journey, and because of that emotional connection, the language becomes meaningful. It sticks with you, it becomes part of who you are. Think about the stories that have stayed with you, whether they were told to you as a child, read in a book, or heard in a film. You probably remember how they made you feel more than the specific words used. That's the power of storytelling, and when it's used in language learning, it transforms the experience from mechanical to memorable. A story can make you laugh, surprise you, even bring a tear to your eye, and through all of that, you're learning. You're understanding vocabulary, absorbing grammar, improving comprehension, and you barely notice because you're so engaged in what's happening. That emotional involvement matters. When you feel something, your brain pays more attention. It remembers better. It forms stronger connections. If you're learning the word lonely, and you read it in a vocabulary list, it's just a word. But if you hear it spoken by a character who's sitting alone in a cafe, watching people pass by, missing someone they love, that word becomes alive. You feel it, and once you've felt it, you don't forget it. That's learning at its most powerful. Stories also give learners a chance to see themselves in the language. Maybe a story reminds you of your own experience, or your own family, or something you've been through. Suddenly, the language doesn't feel foreign. It feels familiar. It feels like something you can connect with, not just as a learner, but as a person. That feeling builds confidence. It helps you believe that English is something you can understand, something you can be part of. And that's another reason storytelling works so well. It breaks down fear. Many learners hesitate to speak because they are afraid of making mistakes. But when you learn through stories, you see characters making mistakes, learning lessons, and growing. You realize that learning is part of being human, and that making errors is natural. That shift in mindset creates space for real progress. You stop aiming for perfection and start focusing on communication. And stories are all about communication. How people express love, fear, joy, hope, sadness. That's the heart of language. When a story is written with care, it respects the learner. It doesn't just try to teach, it tries to touch. It says, here's something real, something you might care about, and invites the listener to explore, and that invitation makes all the difference. You want to listen, you want to understand, you want to find out what happens next. That curiosity is a powerful motivator. It drives you to keep going, even when it's hard. It makes you look up a new word or replay a sentence, not because you have to, but because you want to. And because stories unfold over time, they teach patience and persistence. You don't get all the answers at once. You follow the characters step by step, learning with them. That mirrors the journey of learning English itself. It's not instant, but it's rich and rewarding. Each story you hear, each voice you connect with, becomes another piece of your learning puzzle. Over time, those personal and emotional connections start to shape your relationship with the language. You stop seeing English as a subject to study and start seeing it as a tool to experience life more deeply. You want to hear more voices, read more stories, understand more perspectives. That emotional drive carries you forward in a way that rules and drills never can. Because at the end of the day, people don't learn best when they are told what to remember. They learn best when they feel something, and stories give you that feeling. They let you laugh with someone, cry with someone, hope with someone. And through that, you grow, not just as an English learner, but as a person.